Gorgias by Plato. Contents. Introduction. Gorgias Introduction. In several of Plato's dialogues, there have been doubts among interpreters regarding the main thesis being discussed. The speakers have the freedom to converse without strict rules, and sometimes the digressions seem more interesting. However, even in the most irregular dialogues, there is a natural growth or unity. The beginning is not forgotten at the end, and there are references and allusions that connect the whole dialogue. We must not neglect this unity, but we should also not confine the Platonic dialogue to a single idea. Two tendencies have affected interpreters of Plato. First, they have tried to connect the dialogues to each other, leading to contradictory assertions about their order. Second, they have expanded the scope of each dialogue indefinitely, thinking that this avoids difficulties. However, this approach sacrifices truth and clarity. Metaphysical concepts easily blend with each other, and ancient notions merge with modern theories. A sense of proportion is needed in studying Plato, just as with other great artists. We should not bring moral and intellectual antitheses into the foreground, but instead recognize that they are always present in the background. The Gorgias, like the Phaedrus, has puzzled students of Plato due to the appearance of multiple subjects. Under the guise of rhetoric, higher themes are introduced, and the argument expands into a general view of the good and evil of man. After failing to obtain a sound definition of rhetoric from Gorgias, Socrates assumes the existence of a universal art of flattery or simulation, of which rhetoric is only one branch. The true and noble art of life is opposed to flattery, and those who possess it seek to impart it to others. In the end, this art triumphs, either in this world or the next. These two aspects of life and knowledge are the main ideas of the dialogue. The true and false in individuals and states, in the treatment of the soul and the body, are represented as true and false art. This opposition leads to other questions, including Socratic paradoxes or ideals. 1. Doing evil is worse than suffering evil. 2. When a man has done evil, he is better off being punished. And 3. Bad men do what they think is best, but not what they desire, as everyone desires the good. The distinction between pleasure and good is proven by the simultaneous presence of pleasure and pain, and the fact that bad people can experience pleasures as great as or greater than those of good people. Rhetoricians, as well as poets, musicians, and other artists, are all considered flatterers. The true and false are ultimately judged by the gods in the afterlife. The dialogue naturally falls into three divisions, corresponding to the characters of Gorgias, Polus, and Callicles. The tone and manner change as the argument progresses. Socrates is deferential towards Gorgias, playful and cutting with Polus, and ironic and sarcastic with Callicles. In the first division, the question of what is rhetoric is asked. Gorgias contradicts himself, and the argument is then taken up by his disciple Polus. Eventually, Socrates himself provides the answer, but before he can explain it to Polus, he must enlighten him about the nature of shams or flatteries. When Polus realizes that his beloved art is reduced to the level of cookery, he argues that rhetoricians, like despots, still possess great power. Socrates denies that they have any real power, and hence the three paradoxes mentioned earlier arise. Although they are strange to him, Polus is eventually convinced of their truth. At least, they seem to him to follow logically from the premises. Thus, the second act of the dialogue concludes. Then Callicles enters the scene, initially arguing that pleasure is good, might makes right, and that law is nothing but the combination of the weak against the strong. When he is refuted, he withdraws from the argument and leaves Socrates to arrive at the conclusion on his own. The conclusion is that there are two types of statesmanship, one that improves the people and one that merely flatters them. Socrates urges Callicles to choose the higher form. The dialogue ends with a myth about a final judgment, in which there will be no more flattery or deception, and no further need for the teaching of rhetoric. The characters of the three interlocutors also correspond to the roles assigned to them. Gorgias is the renowned rhetorician, now old, who travels from city to city displaying his talents and is celebrated throughout Greece. Like all the sophists in Plato's dialogues, he is vain and boastful, yet he also has a certain dignity and is treated with respect by Socrates. However, he is no match for Socrates in dialectics. Despite teaching rhetoric his whole life, he is still unable to define his own art. When his ideas start to become clear, he is unwilling to admit that rhetoric can be completely separated from justice and injustice. Socrates detects him in a contradiction due to this lingering sense of morality or regard for public opinion. Like Protagoras, Gorgias is described as generous in nature and expresses approval of Socrates' approach to questioning. He is willing to be refuted and eager for Callicles and Socrates to continue their debate. He understands from experience that rhetoric holds great influence over others, but he cannot explain the puzzle of how rhetoric can teach everything and yet know nothing. Polus is an impulsive young man, described by Socrates as a runaway colt, who initially wanted to take Gorgias' place under the pretext that the old man was tired. He seizes the earliest opportunity to join the discussion. He is said to have written a work on rhetoric and is also mentioned in the Phaedrus as the inventor of balanced or double forms of speech. At first, he is aggressive and ill-mannered, and he becomes angry when he sees his mentor being overthrown. However, under Socrates' guidance, he is soon restored to good humor and compelled to agree with the desired conclusion. Like Gorgias, he is defeated because he compromises. He is unwilling to say that doing is fairer or more honorable than suffering injustice. Although he is fascinated by the power of rhetoric and dazzled by its success, he is not oblivious to higher arguments. Plato may have felt that it would be incongruous for a young person to argue in favor of injustice against the world. Polus has never heard the other side of the question, and he listens to Socrates' paradoxes with evident astonishment. He struggles to understand the meaning of Archelaus being miserable or rhetoric being only useful in self-accusation. When the argument with him reaches its conclusion, Callicles, in whose house they are gathered, enters the stage. Callicles is initially skeptical that Socrates is serious, for if these things are true, then, as he emotionally states, the foundations of society are turned upside down. He represents another type of character, neither a sophist nor a philosopher, but a man of the world and a cultured Athenian gentleman. In modern terms, he could be described as a cynic or materialist, someone who loves power and pleasure and is unscrupulous in his pursuit of both. He has no desire to compromise in the interest of morality, nor does he make any concessions. Like Thrasymachus in the Republic, although he is not of the same weak and vulgar class, he consistently maintains that might is right. His primary motive is political ambition, which is characteristically Greek. Like Anytus in the Meno, he is an enemy of the sophists but favors the new art of rhetoric, which he sees as an excellent weapon for attack and defense. He despises both humanity and philosophy and views the laws of the state as a violation of the natural order, which intended for the stronger to govern the weaker. Like other worldly individuals with a speculative mindset, he generalizes the negative aspects of human nature and easily aligns his principles with his actions. Philosophy and poetry provide him with distinctions that suit his view of human life. He holds a certain admiration for Socrates' talents, while criticizing the trivial use he makes of them. He shows keen intellectual interest in the argument. Like Anytus, he sympathizes with other men of the world, particularly Athenian statesmen of past generations who displayed no weakness or made no mistakes, such as Miltiades, Themistocles, and Pericles. His ideal character is someone with great passions and powers, which they have developed to the fullest and use for their own enjoyment and to govern others. If Critias had been the character instead of Callicles, about whom we have no information from other sources, his opinions would seem to reflect the history of his life. And now the battle intensifies. Callicles embodies the spirit of evil that Socrates is contending against, more so than any other sophist or rhetorician. Callicles represents the spirit of the world, the many opposing the one wise man. The sophists, as described in the Republic, imitate this spirit rather than create it, as they are influenced by public opinion. Socrates approaches Callicles cautiously, using irony to lightly touch upon his personal vices and his pandering to the masses. Despite this, Socrates is earnest in his arguments, as noted by Chaerephon. Callicles becomes increasingly agitated, but the more he is provoked, the more composed and matter-of-fact Socrates becomes. Socrates even delivers a clever retort, possibly aimed at the all-knowing Hippias, displaying his ability to speak at length or concisely. Callicles skillfully defends himself and attacks Socrates, accusing him of triviality and wordplay. He is scandalized when Socrates plainly states the logical consequences of his own argument, as he wishes to maintain the decorum of society. However, Callicles cannot consistently uphold the negative meanings of words. Confused by the abstract concepts of better, superior, and stronger, he is easily turned around by Socrates and only continues the argument due to the authority of Gorgias. At one point, when Socrates describes how ambitious citizens must align themselves with the people, Callicles partially recognizes the truth in his words. The Socrates and the Gorgias can be compared to the Socrates and the Protagoras and Meno. Like in other dialogues, he opposes the sophists and rhetoricians, as well as the statesmen whom he sees as a similar breed. Socrates' behavior is influenced by that of his opponents. Any arrogance or self-centeredness they display is met with corresponding irony from Socrates. He must speak, for philosophy does not allow him to remain silent. He is more ironic and provoking in this dialogue than in any other of Plato's works, as he is pushed to his limits by Callicles' worldliness. However, he is also deeply committed to his beliefs. Socrates reaches a higher level of intensity than even in the Phaedo and Crito. Initially shrouding his moral convictions in dust and dialectics, he eventually loses himself, his method, and his life within them. Similar to the Protagoras and Phaedrus, he discards his ironic veil and delivers a speech, but only after his opponent refuses to answer any more questions. He has a premonition of his own fate looming over him. He knows that Socrates, the only true teacher of politics, as he dares to call himself, cannot safely wage war against the entire world and will be condemned in earthly courts. However, he believes he will be vindicated in the afterlife. Then, the roles of Socrates and Callicles will be reversed, and all the insults and indignities that Callicles prophesied for Socrates in this life will befall Callicles himself. There is an interesting reference to Socrates' own behavior during the trial of the generals after the Battle of Arginusi, which he ironically attributes to his ignorance of proper voting procedures in the assembly. This event is said to have occurred last year 406 BC, so the assumed date of the dialogue is set at 405 BC, when Socrates would have already been an old man. The date is clearly stated but is not easily reconciled with another indication of time, namely the recent usurpation of Archelaus in 413 BC, or the recent death of Pericles, who actually died 24 years earlier in 429 BC and is later referred to as a statesman of a past age. The mention of Nicias, who died in 413 BC but is spoken of as a living witness, also poses a discrepancy. However, it should be noted that while there is a general consistency of time and characters in Plato's dialogues, the precise dramatic dates are inventions of his commentators. The conclusion of the dialogue is notable for Socrates' declaration of ignorance regarding the true nature and significance of these matters, while simultaneously asserting that anyone who holds a different view is absurd. This profession of ignorance is reminiscent of the earlier, more purely Socratic dialogues. However, in those dialogues, as well as in the Apology and Xenophon's Memorabilia, Socrates never expresses doubt about the fundamental truths of morality. He considers morality to be one of the few principles that remain unshaken among the multitude of questions that plague human life. He does not insist on the literal truth of the myth, as he does in the Phaedo, but rather emphasizes the soundness of the doctrine contained within it, that doing wrong is worse than suffering, and that one should strive to be rather than to appear. The next best thing to being just is to be corrected and become just. Socrates also advocates for avoiding flattery, both of oneself and others, and for using rhetoric only in service of what is right. The revelation of another life is a reiteration of the argument in a metaphorical manner. Socrates makes the unique remark that he is the only true politician of his time. In other passages, particularly in the Apology, he denies being a politician at all. He believes that if he or any other good man were to resist the will of the people, they would be put to death before they could do any good for themselves or others. Here, he anticipates a similar fate for himself because he is the only man of the present day who performs his public duties at all. These two perspectives are not truly contradictory, but the difference between them is worth noting. Socrates is both a public and a non-public figure. Not in the usual sense, like Alcibiades or Pericles, but in a higher sense. This will eventually lead to the same consequences for him. He cannot be a private individual even if he wanted to, nor can he separate morals from politics. He is not unwilling to be a politician, despite foreseeing the dangers that await him. However, he must first become a better and wiser person because he, like Callicles, is in a state of confusion and uncertainty. Yet, there is an inconsistency. Shouldn't Socrates have taught the citizens better so they wouldn't put him to death? Now, as he himself says, let's resume the argument from the beginning. Socrates, accompanied by his loyal disciple, Chaerephon, encounters Callicles in the streets of Athens. He learns that he just missed an exhibition by Gorgias, which he regrets because he wanted to question him about the nature of his art, not just hear him display his rhetoric. Callicles suggests that they go to his house where Gorgias is staying. There, They find the renowned rhetorician and his younger friend and disciple, Polus.
Ask him the question, Chaerephon.
What question?
Who is he? A question that would prompt a man to answer, I am a cobbler. Polus offers to answer on behalf of Gorgias, thinking that he might be tired. Chaerephon imitates Socrates and asks, who is Gorgias? Polus responds with rhetorical and balanced phrases, describing Gorgias as one of the best of men, and a proficient in the best and noblest of experimental arts, and so on. Socrates is dissatisfied with the lengthy and meaningless answer. He tells the disconcerted Polus that he has mistaken the quality for the nature of the art. Socrates then remarks to Gorgias that Polus has learned how to make a speech but not how to answer a question. He expresses his desire for Gorgias to answer him. Gorgias is willing and responds to Chaerephon's question, stating that he is a rhetorician and boasts of being a good one in Homeric language. At Socrates' request, Gorgias promises to be brief, as he can be as long or as short as he pleases. Socrates suggests that Gorgias should save his length for others and proceeds to ask him a series of questions. Gorgias answers to Socrates' satisfaction, displaying brevity that impresses Socrates.
The outcome of the discussion can be summarized as follows. Rhetoric deals with discourse, but so do music, medicine, and other specific arts. So, how does rhetoric differ from them? Gorgias distinguishes between arts that deal with words and arts that involve external actions. Socrates expands on this distinction and divides all productive arts into two categories. 1. Arts that can be practiced silently, and 2. Arts that involve words or where words are inseparable from action, such as arithmetic, geometry, and rhetoric. However, Gorgias could not have meant to say that arithmetic is the same as rhetoric. Even within the arts that involve words, there are differences. So, what distinguishes rhetoric from other word-related arts? The words which rhetoric uses pertain to the best and greatest aspects of human life. But tell me, Gorgias, what are the best aspects? Health first, beauty next, wealth third, as stated in the old song. How would you rank them? The arts will come to you collectively, each claiming superiority and asserting that its own good is greater than that of the others. How will you choose between them? I would say, Socrates, that the art of persuasion, which grants freedom to all people and gives individuals power in the state, is the greatest good. But what is the exact nature of this persuasion? Socrates persistently asks. You couldn't describe Zeuxis as merely a painter or even as a painter of figures if there were other painters of figures. Similarly, you can't define rhetoric solely as an art of persuasion because there are other arts that persuade, such as arithmetic, which persuades about odd and even numbers. Gorgias realizes the need for further clarification and now defines rhetoric as the art of persuading in the law courts and in the assembly about matters of justice and injustice. However, there are still two types of persuasion, one that imparts knowledge and another that induces belief without knowledge. Knowledge is always true, while belief can be either true or false. This leads to another question. Which type of persuasion does rhetoric achieve in courts of law and assemblies? Clearly, it is the persuasion that generates belief and not knowledge, because one cannot impart genuine knowledge on such matters to a crowd of people in a few minutes. Another point to consider is that when the assembly gathers to discuss matters like walls, docks, or military expeditions, they do not consult rhetoricians but rather architects or generals. How would Gorgias explain this phenomenon? There are several disciples, including Socrates, who are eagerly asking what rhetoric will teach them about persuading or advising the state. Gorgias illustrates the nature of rhetoric by using the examples of Themistocles, who convinced the Athenians to build their docks and walls, and Pericles, who spoke about the middle wall of the Piraeus. Gorgias also mentions his own ability to persuade patients of his brother Herodicus. He believes that a rhetorician can be more popular and influential than a physician. However, he acknowledges that rhetoric, like any good thing, can be misused. Gorgias does not believe that the teacher of rhetoric should be considered unjust because some of his students use the lessons for unethical purposes. Socrates wants to know if Gorgias will argue with him if he points out an inconsistency in his argument, or if he is open to being refuted. Gorgias declares that he is open to being refuted but worries that the argument may become tedious. The company encourages them to continue. Socrates points out the supposed inconsistency in Gorgias' argument, suggesting that the rhetorician must know about justice, just as he knows about medicine or building. Gorgias admits that if the rhetorician did not know about justice before, They would learn it from their teacher as part of the art of rhetoric. Socrates argues that if someone learns carpentry, they become a carpenter, and if someone learns music, they become a musician. Therefore, if someone learns justice, they become just. This means that the rhetorician must be a just person, and rhetoric is a just thing. However, Gorgias has already admitted that rhetoric can be abused and the rhetorician can act unjustly. Socrates questions how to explain this inconsistency. He suggests that a person can know about justice but not be just, and a teacher cannot completely counteract someone's natural character. Additionally, a person may have some degree of justice but still do wrong. Polus becomes frustrated with this argument, unable to detect the sophism. Socrates sarcastically remarks that when old men stumble, the young help them up, and he is willing to retract his argument if proven wrong, but only if Polus keeps his response brief. Polus is indignant at not being allowed to use as many words as he wants in Athens. Socrates retorts that it will be even harder for him if he has to stay and listen to Polus. After some back and forth, they agree that Polus will ask and Socrates will answer. Polus asks what rhetoric is, and Socrates responds that it is not an art at all, but rather something that Polus claims to have created. Polus asks for clarification, and Socrates explains that rhetoric is an experience or routine that creates a kind of delight or gratification. Polus then asks if rhetoric is a good thing, to which Socrates replies that he has not yet defined what rhetoric is. Socrates asks Polus to ask another question, this time about cookery. Polus asks what cookery is, and Socrates answers that it is an experience or routine that creates a kind of delight or gratification. Socrates concludes that rhetoric and cookery fall under the same category and that rhetoric needs to be distinguished from cookery. Polus asks once again what rhetoric is, and Socrates responds that it is a part of a not very respectable whole, which can be called flattery. Polus asks which part, and Socrates says that it is a shadow of a part of politics. Gorgias and Polus find this explanation confusing, so Socrates clarifies by explaining the difference between shadows or appearances and realities. He uses the examples of real health of body or soul versus the appearance of health, real arts and sciences versus their simulations. Socrates explains that there are 4 arts or sciences that correspond to the soul and body: politics, which has a legislative and judicial part, and an unnamed art that attends to the body, which includes medicine and gymnastics. There are also 4 simulations or shams of these arts, which are mere experiences without their own justification. Dressing up is the simulation of gymnastics, cookery is the simulation of medicine, rhetoric is the simulation of justice, and sophistry is the simulation of legislation. In summary, the formula is tiring, gymnastic, cookery, medicine, sophistic, legislation, and cooking, medicine, rhetoric, the art of justice. This is the true comparison between them, but when judged solely by the pleasure they bring, they become mixed up and return to their original chaos. Socrates apologizes for the length of his speech, which was necessary to explain the subject, and asks Polus not to retaliate unnecessarily. Are you saying that rhetoricians are considered flatterers? They are not considered anything. Why? Don't they have great power, and can they not do whatever they want? They have no power, and they only do what they think is best, never what they desire, because they never achieve the true object of desire, which is the good. As if you, Socrates, would not envy someone with absolute power, who can imprison, exile, or kill whoever they please. But Socrates replies that he has no desire to kill anyone. Even if someone kills another person justly, they should not be envied, and if they kill unjustly, they should be pitied. It is better to suffer than to commit injustice. He does not consider carrying a dagger and killing people or setting a house on fire to be real power. Polus agrees with this, arguing that such acts would be punished, but he still believes that wrongdoers, if unpunished, may be happy enough. He mentions Archelaus, son of Perdiccas, who usurped the throne of Macedonia. Doesn't Socrates think he is happy? Socrates would like to know more about him. He cannot declare even a great king to be happy unless he knows his mental and moral condition. Polus explains that Archelaus was a slave, being the son of a woman who was the slave of Alcidas, brother of Perdiccas, the king of Macedon. Archelaus committed every kind of crime, first murdering his uncle, then his cousin and half-brother, in order to obtain the kingdom. This was very wicked, and yet everyone, including Socrates, would like to be in his position. Socrates dismisses the appeal to numbers. Polus, if he wishes, can gather all the wealthy men of Athens, Nicias and his brothers, aristocrates, the Pericles family, or any other prominent family. This is the kind of evidence presented in courts of justice, where the truth depends on numbers. But Socrates presents a different kind of proof. He appeals to only one witness, the person he is speaking with, and he will convict him out of his own words. He is prepared to show, in his own way, that Archelaus cannot be both wicked and happy. An evildoer is considered happy if he escapes punishment and miserable if he is punished, but Socrates believes that he is less miserable if he suffers punishment than if he escapes. Polus thinks this paradox hardly deserves refutation and is already refuted by the fact. Socrates only needs to compare the fate of a successful tyrant, who is envied by the world, with that of a wretch who, after being caught in a criminal attempt against the state, is crucified or burned to death. Socrates argues that if both are guilty, both are miserable, but the one who goes unpunished is more miserable. Polus laughs at this, which leads Socrates to remark that laughter is a new form of refutation. Polus replies that he is already refuted because if he were to take a vote from the company, he would find that no one agrees with him. Socrates responds that he is not a public figure and cannot take the votes of a group, as he had shown in a recent event. He can only deal with one witness at a time, the person he is arguing with. But he is certain that in anyone's opinion, doing evil is worse than suffering evil. Polus, although he does not admit this, is willing to acknowledge that doing evil is considered more foul or dishonorable. But what is fair and what is foul, whether applied to bodies, colors, shapes, laws, habits, or studies, must be defined with respect to pleasure and utility. Polus agrees with this doctrine and is easily convinced that the fouler of two things must exceed the other in either pain or harm. However, doing evil cannot exceed suffering evil and pain, so it must exceed in harm. Thus, by Polus' own testimony, doing evil is proven to be worse or more harmful than suffering. The other question remains, is a guilty person better off when punished or when unpunished? Socrates replies that what is done justly is suffered justly. If the act is just, the consequence is just. If punishing is just, being punished is just, and therefore fair, and therefore beneficial. The benefit is that the soul is improved. There are three evils a person may suffer from, affecting their wealth, body, and soul: poverty, disease, and injustice. Of these, injustice is the foulest, the evil of the soul, because it causes the greatest harm. And there are three arts that heal these evils: trade, medicine, and justice. Of these, justice is the fairest. Happy is the person who has never committed injustice, and secondarily happy is the person who has been healed through punishment. Therefore, the criminal should go to the judge as they would to a physician, and cleanse themselves of their crime. Rhetoric will enable them to display their guilt in the proper light and to endure the necessary penalty themselves and help others endure it as well. Similarly, if a person has an enemy, they will desire not to punish them, but to let them go unpunished and become worse and worse, taking care only that they do no harm to themselves. 1. These are some possible uses of the art, and we haven't discovered any others. Callicles, who has been listening in silence, asks Chaerephon if Socrates is serious. He then asks Socrates the same question, because if these doctrines are true, life has been turned upside down and we are all doing the opposite of what we should be doing. Socrates playfully replies that before people can understand each other, they must have some common feeling. He and Callicles have this community of feeling because they both have loves. Callicles loves the Athenian Demos and Demos, the son of Pyrilampus. Socrates loves Alcibiades and philosophy. Callicles cannot contradict his loves. He changes his opinions as Demos changes, and he repeats their sentiments. If anyone is surprised by his words and actions, it's because he is not a free agent and must always imitate his two loves. Socrates' peculiarities can be explained in the same way. He always repeats what his mistress, philosophy, is saying to him, who, unlike his other love, Alcibiades, is always the same and always true. Callicles must refute philosophy, or he will never be at peace with himself, and discord in life is worse than discord in music. Callicles explains that Gorgias was overthrown because, in compliance with popular prejudice, he admitted that if his pupil didn't know justice, the rhetorician must teach him. Polus was similarly entangled because his modesty led him to admit that suffering is more honorable than doing injustice. Callicles argues that by custom, suffering is more honorable, but not by nature. Socrates always plays between these two points of view, putting one in the place of the other. In this argument, what Polus meant conventionally has been affirmed by Socrates as a law of nature. Convention says that injustice is dishonorable, but nature says that might is right. We always tame down the nobler spirits among us to the conventional level. However, sometimes a great man rises up and asserts his original rights, disregarding our conventions, and then the light of natural justice shines forth. Pindar says, Law, the king of all, does violence with high hand, as proven by the example of Heracles, who took Geryont's oxen without paying for them. This is the truth, Socrates, as you will be convinced if you leave philosophy and engage in the real business of life. A little philosophy is good, but too much ruins a person. If someone hasn't passed their metaphysics before reaching adulthood, they will never understand the world. Philosophers are ridiculous when they enter politics, and politicians are equally ridiculous when they delve into philosophy. Every man, as Euripides says, is fondest of that in which he is best. Philosophy is graceful in youth, like the lisp of infancy, and should be part of education. But when an adult lisps or studies philosophy, I would like to beat them. Those refined individuals never achieve anything. They avoid the company of people and hide in corners, whispering to a few admiring youths and never expressing any noble sentiments. I have regard for you, Socrates, and therefore I say to you, as Zethus says to Amphion in the play, that you have a noble soul disguised in a puerile exterior. You should consider the danger you and other philosophers face. If someone accused you in a court of law, you wouldn't know how to defend yourself. You would stand there, with a gaping mouth and a dizzy brain, and you could be murdered, robbed, or slapped without consequence. Take my advice and get some common sense. Leave these frivolities to others. Follow the ways of the wealthy and be wise. Socrates claims to have found in Callicles the philosopher's touchstone, and he is certain that any opinion they both agree on must be the truth. Callicles possesses the three qualities needed in a critic: knowledge, goodwill, and frankness. Gorgias and Polus, although learned, were too modest, and their modesty made them contradict themselves. But Callicles is well educated and not too modest to speak out. His goodwill is evident in his profession and in giving the same caution against philosophy to Socrates that Socrates remembers him giving to his own group of friends long ago. Callicles promises to retract any errors pointed out to him. However, he wants to know first what he and Pindar mean by natural justice. Do they believe that the rule of justice is the rule of the stronger or the better? There is no difference. Then aren't the majority superior to the individual, and aren't their opinions better? According to them, justice is equality, and doing wrong is more dishonorable than suffering wrong. As the majority is superior or stronger, their opinion must align with both natural and conventional justice. Why do you keep splitting hairs? Haven't I told you that the superior is the better? But what do you mean by the better? Please explain, and please use milder language if you don't want to drive me away. I mean the more worthy, the wiser. You mean to say that one intelligent person should rule over 10,000 fools? Yes, that's what I mean. Should the doctor then have a larger portion of food and drink? Or should the weaver have more coats? Or the cobbler bigger shoes? Or the farmer more seed? You always say the same things, Socrates. Yes, and on the same topics too. But you never say the same things. First, you define the superior as the stronger, then the wiser, and now something else. What do you mean? I mean men with political ability who should govern and have more than those they govern. More than themselves? What do you mean? I mean that every man is his own ruler. I see that you mean those fools, the temperate. But my belief is that a man should let his desires grow and find ways to satisfy them. For many, this is impossible, so they join together to prevent him. But if he is a king and has power, how base would it be for him to submit to them? To invite the common people to be his lord when he could have the enjoyment of all things? Because the truth is, Socrates, that luxury and self-indulgence are virtue and happiness. Everything else is just talk. Socrates compliments Callicles for his frankness in saying what others only think. According to his view, those who want nothing are not happy. Why, says Callicles, if they were, stones and the dead would be happy. In reply, Socrates goes into a half-serious, half-comic reflection. Who knows, as Euripides says, whether life may not be death, and death life? There are even philosophers who argue that even in life, we are dead, and that the body is the tomb of the soul. And some clever Sicilian has made an allegory in which he portrays fools as the uninitiated, who are carrying water to a vessel that is holes, using a similarly holy sieve, and this sieve is their own soul. The idea is imaginative but represents a truth that I want you to acknowledge, namely that a life of contentment is better than a life of indulgence. Do you agree with that? Far from it. Then listen to another analogy. The life of contentment and self-indulgence can be represented by two men filling jars with streams of wine, honey, milk. The jars of one are intact, while the jars of the other are leaky. The first fills his jars and has no further trouble with them, while the second is constantly refilling them and would suffer extreme misery if he stopped. Do you still hold the same opinion? Yes, Socrates, and the analogy expresses what I mean. True pleasure is a perpetual stream, flowing in and flowing out. To be hungry and always eating, to be thirsty and always drinking, and to have all other desires and satisfy them, that, as I admit, is my idea of happiness. And to be itchy and always scratching? I don't deny that there may be happiness even in that. And to indulge in unnatural desires if they are abundantly satisfied? Callicles is outraged by the introduction of such topics. But Socrates reminds him that they were introduced by the advocate of pleasure and good, not by him. Does Callicles still maintain this? Yes, for the sake of consistency, he will. Socrates is not satisfied with the answer and fears that he is losing his touchstone. Callicles professes seriousness, reassuring him, and they continue the argument. Pleasure and good are the same, but knowledge and courage are not the same as pleasure or good, or even with each other. Socrates disproves the first statement by showing that two opposites cannot coexist but must alternate with each other. It is impossible to be well and ill at the same time. But pleasure and pain are simultaneous, and their cessation is simultaneous, as in the case of drinking and thirsting. On the other hand, good and evil are not simultaneous and do not cease at the same time. Therefore, pleasure cannot be the same as good. Callicles has already lost his temper and can only be persuaded to continue by Gorgias' intervention. Socrates, having already distinguished courage and knowledge from pleasure and good, proceeds. The good are good because they possess goodness, and the bad are bad because they possess evil. The brave and wise are good, and the cowardly and foolish are bad. And he who feels pleasure is good, and he who feels pain is bad, and both feel pleasure and pain to almost the same degree, sometimes even more so for the bad man or coward. Therefore, the bad man or coward is as good as the brave man, or perhaps even better. Callicles now tries to avoid the inevitable absurdity by affirming that he and all mankind admit that some pleasures are good and others are bad. The good are beneficial and the bad are harmful, and we should choose the one and avoid the other. But as Socrates points out, this is a return to his old doctrine that all things should be done for the sake of the good. Callicles agrees with this, and Socrates, finding that they agree in distinguishing pleasure from good, reverts to his previous division of empirical habits, flattery, and the arts concerned with the higher interests of the soul and body. Does Callicles agree with this division? Callicles will agree to anything just to get through the argument. So which of the arts are flatteries? Flute playing, harp playing, choral exhibitions, the dithyrambics of Synesius are all equally condemned because they only provide pleasure. Even Meles the harp player, who was the father of Synesius, failed in that regard. The noble art of tragedy is focused on pleasure rather than improvement. Poetry, in general, is simply a rhetorical address to a diverse audience of men, women, and children. The orators are far from speaking with the intention of doing what is best. Their aim is to please the crowd as if they were children. Callicles argues that this is only true for some orators. Others genuinely care about their fellow citizens. Socrates grants this point and acknowledges that there are two types of oratory, flattery and genuine concern for the citizens. However, he questions where the orators who possess the latter quality can be found. Callicles admits that there are none left, but they did exist in the days when Themistocles, Cimon, Miltiades, and the great Pericles were alive. Socrates counters that none of these individuals were true artists who aimed to bring order out of disorder. A good and true orator has a purpose that guides their life, which they align their words and actions with. They seek to promote justice and eradicate injustice, to instill virtue and eliminate vice in the minds of their fellow citizens. They are like physicians who do not allow sick individuals to indulge in various foods and drinks, but instead emphasize self-restraint. This is beneficial for the soul and superior to the unrestrained indulgence that Callicles recently approved. At this point, Callicles, who was reluctant to agree, becomes restless and suggests that Socrates should answer his own questions. Socrates responds by saying that one person must do the work of two. Although he had hoped to give Callicles an Amphion in return for his Zethus, he is willing to continue. However, he hopes that Callicles will correct him if he makes any mistakes. Socrates summarizes the advantages he has already presented. Pleasure is not the same as goodness, but pleasure should be pursued for the sake of goodness. Goodness is what makes us good, and all good things possess some form of virtue. Virtue, whether in the body or soul, in things or individuals, is not achieved by chance but through order and harmony. A soul that is ordered is better than one that is not, and therefore it is temperate and good. Conversely, the intemperate soul is bad. The temperate individual is also just, brave, and pious, and has reached the pinnacle of goodness and happiness. The intemperate person, whom Callicles approves of, is the opposite and is miserable. Therefore, those who seek happiness must pursue temperance, avoid intemperance, and if possible, avoid punishment. However, if they have done wrong, they must endure punishment. In this way, both states and individuals should strive for harmony, which wise individuals tell us is the bond between heaven and earth, gods and men. Callicles has never understood the power of geometrical proportion in both worlds. He believes that people should aim for disproportion and excess. However, if he is wrong and self-control is the true secret to happiness, then the paradox holds true that the only use of rhetoric is for self-accusation. Polus was right in saying that doing wrong is worse than suffering wrong, and Gorgias was right in saying that a rhetorician must be a just person. Callicles was wrong in taunting Socrates about his defenseless condition and suggesting that he could be accused, put to death, or struck with impunity. Socrates reiterates that striking is worse than being struck. Doing wrong is worse than suffering wrong. What he said before is now firmly established. He himself does not know the true nature of these things, but he knows that no one can deny his words without being ridiculous. Doing wrong is the greatest evil, and suffering wrong is the second greatest evil. To avoid the latter, one must be a ruler or a friend of a ruler. To be a friend, one must be equal to the ruler and resemble them. Under the ruler's protection, one will not suffer any harm, but will they also refrain from doing harm? Will they not, in fact, do all the harm they can and get away with it? In this way, the greatest evil of all will befall them. Callicles retorts that this imitator of a tyrant will kill anyone who does not imitate them in the same way. Socrates acknowledges that he has heard this argument many times and can only reply that a bad person will kill a good person. Callicles finds this frustrating, but it is not frustrating to a sensible person who is not studying the arts that will protect them from danger. As Callicles says, this is the purpose of rhetoric in courts of justice. However, there are many other arts that also save people from death and yet are quite humble in their claims, such as swimming or piloting. Does not the pilot provide at least as much service as the rhetorician? Yet for the journey from Aegina to Athens, a pilot does not charge more than 2 obols and is unassuming when they disembark. The reason is that the pilot is uncertain whether they have truly benefited their passengers by saving them from death. If one of the passengers is physically or mentally ill, who can say? Similarly, an engineer often saves entire cities, yet they are despised, and you would not allow your son to marry their daughter or vice versa. But what is the reason behind this? If virtue only means saving lives, whether your own or someone else's, you have no right to despise him or anyone who practices life-saving arts. But isn't virtue something different from saving and being saved? Instead, consider whether you should disregard the length of life and focus on living the best life possible, leaving the rest to fate. You can't expect to have influence with the Athenian people or with Demos, the son of Pyrilampus, unless you become like them. What do you say to this? There is some truth in what you are saying, but I don't completely believe you. That's because you are infatuated with Demos. But let's have a little more conversation. Remember the 2 processes we discussed before, one directed towards pleasure and the other towards making people as good as possible. Those who are responsible for governing the city should strive to make the citizens as good as possible. But who would undertake a public building project if they had never been taught the art of building or had never built anything before? Or who would take on the role of a state physician if they had never cured themselves or anyone else? Shouldn't we examine them before entrusting them with such responsibilities? And since Callicles is about to enter public life, shouldn't we examine him as well? Who has he made better? Because we have already agreed that this is the true task of a statesman. We should ask the same question about Pericles, Cimon, Miltiades, and Themistocles. Who did they make better? Didn't Pericles actually make the citizens worse? He gave them pay, and at first, he was very popular with them, but in the end, they condemned him to death. Surely, a bad animal trainer is one who, instead of taming animals, teaches them to kick and attack, and humans are animals too. Pericles, who was responsible for the well-being of humans, only made them wilder, more savage, and unjust. Therefore, he couldn't have been a good statesman. The same can be said about Cimon, Themistocles, and Miltiades. But a charioteer who remains in control of the chariot as they gain more experience and skill is not thrown out. This suggests that the statesmen of the past were no better than those of our time. They may have been more skilled in building docks and harbors, but they did not improve the character of the citizens. I have repeatedly told you, using the same examples, that the soul, like the body, can be treated in two ways. There is a lower and a higher art. You seem to understand this when I first mentioned it, but when I asked you who the truly good statesmen were, you answered as if I had asked you who the good trainers were, and you replied with names like Thierry the baker, Mythicus the author of the Sicilian cookery book, and Cerambus the vintner. You would be offended if I told you that these are just cooks who make people fat only to make them thin again. And those who have been fattened by them applaud them instead of criticizing them, blaming their subsequent health problems on their physicians. In this respect, Callicles, you are like them. You applaud the statesmen of old who catered to the vices of the citizens and focused on building docks and harbors, but neglected virtue and justice. And when the consequences of their actions come, the citizens who once applauded Themistocles, Pericles, and others will turn against you and my friend Alcibiades, and you will suffer for the misdeeds of your predecessors. The old story is always repeated. After all his services, the ungrateful city banished him or condemned him to death. The statesman should have taught the city better. He can't blame the city for unjustly using him, just as a sophist or teacher can't blame their students for cheating them. The sophist and the orator are in the same situation. Although you admire rhetoric and despise sophistry, sophistry is actually the higher of the two. The teacher of the arts takes money, but the teacher of virtue or politics doesn't, because this kind of service is the only one that motivates the student to repay their teacher. Socrates concludes by asking Callicles to which mode of serving the state he invites him. Callicles replies, to the inferior and ministerial one. Socrates responds that this is the only way to avoid death, as he has heard enough times that the bad man will kill the good. But he believes that such a fate is likely for him because he realizes that he is the only person who truly teaches the art of politics. Just as he described to Polus, he may be the physician who is judged by a jury of children. He can't say that he has brought the citizens any pleasure, and if anyone accuses him of confusing them or insulting their elders, he won't be able to make them understand that he has only acted out of a desire for their well-being. Therefore, he doesn't know what his fate will be. Callicles asks, do you think a man who is unable to help himself is in a good condition? Socrates replies, yes, Callicles, if he has the true self-help, which is never having said or done anything wrong to himself or others. If I didn't have this kind of self-help, I would be ashamed. But if I die because I lack your flattering rhetoric, I will die in peace. Death is not an evil, but going to the underworld burdened with offenses is the worst of evils. To prove my point, I will tell you a story. During the reign of Cronos, men were judged on the day of their death. After their judgment, the good went to the islands of the blessed, while the bad went to a place of punishment. However, since they were still alive and wearing their clothes during the judgment, favoritism occurred. When Zeus came to power, he had to change the process. He sent Prometheus to take away their knowledge of when they would die. Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus were appointed as judges. Rhadamanthus judged for Asia, Aeacus for Europe, and Minos was the court of appeal. Death is the separation of soul and body, but after death, both retain their characteristics. Even after death, one can still distinguish between a fat man, a dandy, and a branded slave. Rhadamanthus could instantly recognize a prince or king, even if he didn't know their identity. He would see the scars of perjury and wickedness and send them to the house of torment. There are two types of souls that face punishment, the curable and the incurable. The curable are those who benefit from their punishment, while the incurable, like Archelaus, serve as a warning to others. Sisyphus and Tychius, not Thersites, are believed to be undergoing eternal punishment according to Homer. This doesn't mean that a great man can't be a good one, as shown by the example of Aristides. To Rhadamanthus, souls are only known as good or bad. They are stripped of their titles and positions. The bad are sent to Tartarus, labeled as either curable or incurable, while the good are sent to the islands of the blessed. Aeacus follows a similar practice, and Minos oversees them all. My wish is that we present our souls undefiled to the judge on that day, and my desire in life is to be able to face death. I challenge you, and I throw back at you the reproach that you cast upon me. I hope that you will stand before the judge, confused and with a dizzy brain, and that someone may harm you. You may think this is just an old wives' tale. But you, who are considered the 3 wisest men in Greece, have nothing better to say, and no one will ever prove that doing evil is better than suffering it. A person should strive to be good, not just to appear good. If someone is bad, they should become good and avoid flattery from both the many and the few. Follow me, and if you are looked down upon, it won't harm you. Once we have practiced virtue, we can involve ourselves in politics, but only after we have escaped the shameful state of ignorance and uncertainty we are currently in. Let us follow the path of virtue and justice, not the path you, Callicles, are inviting us towards, for that path is worthless. Now, let's consider some of the main points of the dialogue. First, considering Plato's age and the ironic nature of his writings, we can compare him with himself and other great teachers. We can also address the objections of his critics. Second, as we analyze Plato, we should also reflect on ourselves and try to extract the timeless lessons he teaches, stripped of the specific form they are presented in. In the Gorgias, as in most of Plato's dialogues, we see that formal logic doesn't yet exist. The challenge of defining things reemerges, and the confusing analogy between arts and virtues persists. Ambiguities in words like nature, custom, the honorable, and the good remain unresolved. The sophists still struggle with distinguishing the real from the apparent. Arguments are often based on figures of speech. The possibility of conceiving a universal art or science that can be applied to specific subjects remains a difficulty that hasn't been solved and still troubles us today. The lack of clarity is also evident in Socrates himself, unless we assume he is playing with his opponent's simplicity or conducting a dialectical experiment. His supposed contradiction in Gorgias' answers is highly fallacious. His victories over Polus are also due to a false opposition between pleasure and good, as well as an incorrect assertion that an agent and a patient can be described with the same qualities. This mistake is partially shared and corrected by Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics. There are also traces of a robust sophistry in his argument with Callicles. Although Socrates claims to be convinced by reason alone, his arguments often serve as a sort of dialectical fiction to lead himself and others towards his own ideal of life and action. Sometimes, we may wish we could suggest answers to his opponents or point out the flaws hidden behind ambiguous terms like good and pleasure. However, it would be pointless to examine his arguments using modern logic or to criticize his ideal from a purely utilitarian perspective. If we acknowledge that the ideal is generally considered unachievable, and that people will not agree that a criminal is happier when punished than when not punished, just as they would not agree with the Stoic idea that a person can be happy while being tortured. Plato is already aware that the majority of people do not support his views. He does not mean to say that Archelaus is tormented by guilt, or that the sensations of a criminal impaled on a stake are more pleasant than those of a tyrant indulging in luxury. He is also not referring to virtue as a calculation of pleasure, as he later rejects this idea in the Phaedo. So, what does he mean? To understand Plato's meaning, it is best to draw parallels with similar notions that have always existed among humans, whether logically justifiable or not. It is important to note that Socrates himself implies that only a few will truly understand or appreciate his ideas. He is not speaking of the conscious experience of happiness, but rather the concept of happiness. When a martyr dies for a noble cause, or when a soldier falls in battle, we do not assume that death or wounds are without pain, or that their physical suffering is always compensated by mental satisfaction. However, we still consider them to be happy, and we would prefer their death 1,000 times over a shameful life. This is not solely because we believe they will achieve fame in the afterlife, or receive glory while their enemies suffer. There are instances where individuals act morally without regard for public opinion or consequences, and we consider them happy solely for this reason, much like how Socrates' friends at the beginning of the Phaedo view him. Or as others have described someone as having an angelic face. We are not concerned with justifying this idealism based on utility or public opinion, but rather pointing out the existence of such a sentiment in the better part of human nature. Plato's idealism is founded on this sentiment. He argues that truth and righteousness should be sought above all else, and that all other goods are only desirable as means to achieve these. Some may argue that he errs by only considering the individual and not the happiness of others.